She smiled on a stage and handed me divorce papers, in front of investors, clients, and cameras. So I answered the only way she never expected. The night was supposed to be about her, and I showed up ready to stand quietly where I always had, just behind the spotlight, holding pride instead of needing credit. The riverfront hall was glowing from the inside, warm light spilling onto the sidewalk, laughter leaking through the doors like proof of success. I parked farther away than I needed to because she wanted the closest spots saved for clients and press. And I didn't argue, I never did. I straightened my jacket the way my father taught me, checked my tie, and carried a small gift bag in my left hand, a leather portfolio I thought she'd appreciate. Something solid, something earned. I walked in believing this was still our life. Inside, the air smelled expensive. Perfume, cologne, fried appetizers, ambition. People clustered in neat groups, voices layered with practiced confidence. At first I felt proud watching her move through the room, shaking hands, smiling wide, sharp and polished. The woman she'd worked so hard to become. Then I noticed the looks, subtle at first, glances that lingered a second too long, smiles that didn't reach the eyes, a laugh that cut off when I stepped closer, and then a man I recognized, someone she called a colleague, said it loud enough that he didn't care who heard. The loser husband finally showed up. Laughter followed, thin and cruel. My chest went hot, but my feet stayed planted. I stood there holding that gift bag while people I'd hosted in my home treated me like entertainment. Then she turned and her smile widened, like this was the moment she'd been waiting for. She crossed the floor with purpose, heels clicking, confidence sharp, and held out a thick white envelope with my name typed clean across the front. She spoke sweet, professional, calm, and told me the first job of her new law firm was divorcing me. Right there, under the lights, surrounded by people who leaned in to watch. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't tear the paper. I didn't give them what they wanted. I took the envelope, nodded once, and walked out. I don't remember the drive home. Just the sound of my front door closing, soft and familiar. The sound of a house that still thought a married man lived there. And as I stood in the dark entryway, jacket sliding from my shoulders onto the same chair it always had, I understood something clearly. She thought she'd ended me with paper. But she had no idea how well I understood what paper could really do. The house felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. Not broken, not loud, just hollow in a way I had never noticed before. I stood in the entryway without turning on the lights, listening to the familiar creaks settle around me, the same sounds I had heard for years. But now they felt like they belonged to someone else. My jacket slipped off my shoulders and landed on the chair by the door, the same chair it always did, and that was when it hit me. Nothing had changed except my place in it. The envelope was still in my hand, heavier than it should have been, not because of what it said, but because of where she chose to hand it to me. I went into the kitchen and poured a glass of water, the pipes groaning the way they always had. Like an old man clearing his throat before speaking, my hands were steady, which surprised me. I sat at the table where we had eaten dinner 1,000 times. Her across from me, talking about cases she hoped to land someday. Back when this firm was just an idea and not a stage, that was when the memories started lining up. Not the romantic ones, the practical ones. The first time she talked seriously about law school. Already in her 40s, everyone else calling it a phase. Me nodding and saying we would make it work. I remembered paying the application fees, the prep courses, covering rent when she cut her hours to study, co-signing loans because my credit was solid and hers was still forming. I remembered her failing the bar the first time, crying into my shoulder right here at this table, and me telling her it was just paper, that it did not define her. That thought stayed with me as I opened the file drawer in the hallway, the one she never touched because she trusted me to handle the numbers. Inside were folders labeled in my handwriting. Neat, deliberate years of quiet responsibility. I pulled one out and held it without opening it right away, feeling the weight of it settle into my palm. When I finally did, there it was, lease agreements, equipment financing, business credit lines, malpractice insurance, startup capital, my signature on every major obligation, not once, but again and again. Personal guarantees, that phrase stood out now. Clear and undeniable, I sat back down and let out a slow breath. She thought the envelope ended something, but all it really did was force me to look at the foundation I had built without ever standing on it. And for the first time that night, I did not feel embarrassed. I felt awake, because I understood then that this was not about heartbreak. It was about accounting, and I had always been very good at accounting. By morning, the shock had burned off, leaving something colder and clearer behind. I woke before the alarm, staring at the ceiling as the furnace kicked on and off, the house breathing around me like it always had, except now it felt larger, emptier. I made coffee the old way, scoop, pour, wait, watching steam curl toward the cabinets we once argued about. She wanted white, I wanted wood. Wood lasts longer. I sat at the table with my mug and opened my mop top. Not to lash out, not to plead, but to take inventory. Because when emotion fails you, structure does not. I opened the folder again, this time with a pen beside me, and read every page slowly. Dates, clauses, notice periods, my name printed clean and steady like the man who signed it. Personal guarantee on the office lease, personal guarantee on the business line of credit, personal guarantee on the copier, the IT services, the equipment financing, each one a quiet yes I had given over the years, without asking for applause. My chest stayed calm as I read, which scared me more than anger would have. This was not impulse. This was alignment. I realized she had treated the marriage like theater. Dramatic gestures, public moments, applause. Well, I had treated it like infrastructure, unseen, essential, expected to hold no matter what weight was placed on it. My phone buzzed on the table, her name lighting up the screen. I let it ring, then buzz again, then a voicemail, her voice controlled, telling me this did not have to get ugly, asking me to sign quietly, reminding me not to embarrass her. I listened once, then set the phone face down. Embarrassment had already happened, just not to the person she thought. I dialed a number I had known for years. A voice answered steady and familiar, and I explained the situation plainly, no insults, no drama, just facts, divorce papers, public service, personal guarantees tied to a business I no longer agreed to be part of. There was a pause, then confirmation I was not trapped. Some guarantees could be withdrawn going forward. Others required notice and time, but all of it was lawful. All of it was clean. When the call ended, I sat back and stared at the ceiling fan as it slowed. Ticking softly like a clock winding down, something settled in my chest. Then, not satisfaction, not revenge, just understanding. She thought power came from the stage, from controlling the story, but real power lived in the fine print, in the quiet places where decisions are honored, whether anyone is watching or not. I opened a new document and began drafting notices one at a time, careful, precise. I was not tearing anything down. I was stepping back inch by inch, exactly the way the contracts allowed. And as the first email confirmation landed in my inbox, small and unremarkable, I understood something she never had. Paper does not humiliate you, it simply tells the truth you agreed to. And that truth was finally working for me. I moved through the day like a man following a checklist. Not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. Each call placed with the same calm tone I used in my own work for decades. I was not arguing, I was notifying, withdrawing from future personal guarantees as allowed. Section numbers referenced, written notice promised, names logged. Every conversation short and professional. The people on the other end did not know my marriage had ended the night before. They did not need to. Contracts do not care about feelings, only compliance. By mid-morning, my phone would not stay quiet. Her calls stacking up, then texts, the tone shifting from confused to sharp, asking what I was doing, warning me about consequences. I set the phone face down and finished what I had started. One obligation at a time, some could be stopped immediately. Others required time and formal letters. And I respected that. I was not trying to break anything. I was removing myself from a structure that had changed without my consent. When doubt crept in, I stood and paced the living room, the old leather chair creaking behind me, and I reminded myself this was not punishment. It was alignment. I was no longer propping up something that had already decided I was expendable. Around noon, I drove to the VFW, the same one I had been going to for years. The flag out front snapping in the cold like it always had. Inside it smelled like bacon grease and old coffee. Honest and familiar, Walt was already there. Reading the paper like it was his job, he looked up and said I had the look of a man reorganizing his life. I told him just enough: public divorce papers, business ties, guarantees being pulled. He listened without interrupting, then said something that stuck, that stepping out of a blast radius is not the same as lighting the fuse. That people who confuse the two have never had to clean up real damage. When I left, I overheard two men talking low near the door. Promises being made, bonuses by Christmas, expansion plans, money that assumed stability. My stomach tightened. Not with guilt, but with concern, I drove home slower, understanding for the first time that this was bigger than me, that my silence and support had been part of a system others were relying on without knowing the truth. That evening her voicemail came again. Sharper now, accusing me of risking livelihoods. I listened, then deleted it, because responsibility does not mean carrying consequences that do not belong to you. As night settled in, the house felt colder, quieter. I stood at the sink rinsing out my mug when the knock came, sharp and impatient, rattling the glass like it expected obedience. I knew who it was before I opened the door. She stood there flushed from the cold and something else, fear, maybe, anger dressed as confidence. She accused me of trying to ruin her, of hiding behind numbers, of playing games, and I listened, leaning against the doorframe, and told her the truth she had avoided. This was business. The same way serving divorce papers on a stage was business. And for the first time, when she threatened court, I did not flinch, because I was no longer reacting to her choices. I was finally acting on my own. The next morning came in gray and thin, the kind of light that makes everything honest. I woke early again, not from panic, but from momentum. Once you start untangling something that's been knotted for years, sleep doesn't argue much. I made coffee, stood at the counter, and listened to the house settle, every sound familiar, every corner still carrying a version of us that no longer applied. I didn't rush. Patience had always been my advantage, and I knew enough to let it work. By mid-morning, the consequences of my quiet steps started showing up, not in explosions, but in pressure. My phone buzzed with messages from numbers I recognized and some I didn't. Short texts asking if I was okay, longer ones warning me I was being talked about, that people were confused, that I should call her back and smooth this out. Smooth, that word again. I read them all and replied to none. Smoothing things over was how I ended up here. I had learned that clarity and comfort rarely coexist, and when forced to choose, clarity lasts longer. I drove back to the VFW later that day, not because I needed advice, but because I needed perspective. Walt saved me a seat without saying a word, poured coffee like it was understood. We sat in that quiet companionship that doesn't demand explanation. When I told him I was being painted as the bad guy, he snorted softly and said people always need a villain when a story falls apart, especially when the truth makes them uncomfortable. That stuck with me, because I realized Diane hadn't just handed me divorce papers that night. She'd handed me a role, the quiet fool, the financial background character who would absorb the hit and disappear. When I left, the cold cut sharp across the parking lot, and I stood there for a moment watching my breath drift away, thinking about all the times I stayed silent to protect her image, all the times I chose support over recognition. And I understood something new: restraint only works when it's mutual. When one person uses it as cover, it turns into exploitation. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me precise. That evening, an email came through from someone I didn't expect, a client of her firm, polite but uneasy, asking a few careful questions about billing and retainers, things that didn't quite add up. I read it twice, then sat back in my chair, the room suddenly very still. This wasn't about divorce anymore. This was about trust. And trust, once questioned, doesn't stay contained. I replied simply, told him to document everything, to protect himself and to let the appropriate channels review it. When I sent that message, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt responsible, because sometimes stepping back exposes cracks that were already there. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the house breathe, understanding that the story was shifting again, no longer centered on humiliation or marriage, but on accountability. And as uncomfortable as that was, I knew one thing for certain: I hadn't caused what was coming. I had only stopped holding it together long enough for the truth to stand on its own. Her reaction came fast after that, faster than I expected. The tone in her messages sharpened, the language turning legal, formal, clipped, like she was trying to put distance between herself and what she was feeling. She accused me of interfering, of creating panic, of overstepping. And for the first time since that night on the stage, I heard fear underneath the polish. Not fear of losing me, fear of losing control. I read every message once, then set the phone down, because responding would only feed the idea that this was a fight. And I wasn't fighting, I was standing still while the ground shifted. By the end of the day, the pressure spread outward. Mutual friends stopped checking in and started checking sides. A couple I'd known for years canceled dinner with a vague apology, saying things were tense and they didn't want to get involved. I understood what that meant. Staying neutral feels safer when someone else is being blamed. I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself. I let the silence do what it does best. Reveal who needs a version of you that stays quiet. That night she showed up again. Not angry this time, controlled, measured, standing in the doorway like she was about to cross-examine me. She said I was risking people's livelihoods. That staff were nervous, that rumors were spreading. I listened, leaning against the counter, and waited for her to finish. When she did, I told her the truth without raising my voice. I said I hadn't touched her firm. I had only removed myself from obligations I never agreed to under these conditions. I said support is not the same as ownership, and silence is not the same as consent. Her jaw tightened, because she had built her confidence on the assumption that I would never correct that distinction. She warned me again about court, about how things could get ugly, and I told her calmly that courts prefer records to speeches, that everything I'd done was documented, timed, lawful, that I wasn't hiding, and that seemed to unsettle her more than shouting ever could. She accused me of being cold, of choosing money over marriage, and that one almost landed, until I realized how backwards it was. She had chosen spectacle over partnership, applause over privacy, and now she wanted me to feel guilty for refusing to play along. After she left, the house felt heavier, not with loss, but with finality. I sat at the table and stared at the grain of the wood. The same burn mark near the edge from years ago adds character, I'd said back then, and it occurred to me that this was character too. Choosing restraint when reaction would have been easier, choosing accuracy when comfort was offered as a substitute. I didn't know yet how far this would go or how many people would be pulled into it, but I knew something important had shifted. I was no longer responding to her version of events. I was living inside my own, and that made all the difference. The call came the next afternoon while I was sorting old mail at the kitchen table, the kind of task you put off until life forces you to slow down. The number was unfamiliar, but something told me not to ignore it. The man on the other end introduced himself carefully, said he was a client of Diane's firm, his voice low, uneasy, like he didn't want to be having this conversation at all. He asked if I had a moment, and I said I did, because when someone sounds like that, you listen. He didn't accuse, didn't rant. He asked questions about retainers, about invoices that didn't line up with the work he'd been promised, about funds that were supposed to be sitting untouched. I felt my chest tighten, not with anger, but with recognition. I'd spent decades in lending. I knew that tone. The sound of a man realizing something he trusted might not be where it was supposed to be. I told him I wasn't part of the firm, that I couldn't speak for their accounting. But I also told him not to ignore his instincts, to document everything, to protect himself. There was a long pause. Then he thanked me. And when the line went dead, the house felt quieter than before. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the wall, understanding that the situation had crossed a line without anyone announcing it. This was no longer about my marriage, or humiliation, or even money. It was about responsibility, about what happens when people build promises on foundations they assume will never move. I thought about the guarantees I had pulled, the quiet support I had withdrawn, and I realized that my silence had been part of the illusion others were relying on. Stopping didn't create the problem, it revealed it. Later that day, I drove to the church, not because I needed prayer, but because the basement was empty on weekdays and I needed space that wasn't my house. Fluorescent lights hummed softly, folding chairs stacked against the wall. A coffee urn sat cold on a table with a handwritten sign that said, "Help yourself." I sat alone and rested my hands on my knees, breathing slow, steady, and said out loud, to no one. I didn't set out to hurt her. I just stopped holding everything up. Hearing it spoken made it clearer, truer. When I got home, another message waited on my phone. Not from her, but from my lawyer, short and direct, saying an emergency motion had been filed to expect service. I didn't panic. I leaned back against the counter and closed my eyes, because this was the moment I'd known was coming. When pressure turns formal and silence is mistaken for weakness. I wasn't weak, I was prepared. I'd lived inside contracts my entire career. I knew how this part worked. That night I slept lightly, not from fear, but from awareness. The sense that events were aligning beyond anyone's control now. When morning came, pale and cold, I understood something with calm certainty. I hadn't pulled the trigger. I'd removed my hands from a structure that was already unstable. Whatever fell next would do so under its own weight, and I would finally be standing clear of it. By mid-morning the next day, the decision stopped feeling optional. It settled into place like something that had always been waiting. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the email from the client still pulled up. Invoices attached, dates lined up in a way that made my jaw tighten. Trust funds were supposed to sit still, untouched, accounted for. That was not a gray area. That was the spine of the profession. I wasn't a lawyer, but I had spent my life around rules that only work if people respect them. I opened the state disciplinary website. Plain and unadorned, no drama, just instructions. I hovered for a moment, not because I was afraid, but because I understood weight. Once something is submitted, it does not come back unchanged. I reminded myself I wasn't accusing, I was reporting. There is a difference. One comes from emotion, the other from obligation. I gathered only what mattered, no commentary, no conclusions. Just documents and timelines, the way I had always done my work. Invoices showing retainers paid, transfers marked temporary that never returned. Emails promising things that numbers didn't support. I typed one sentence, careful and clean. These materials are submitted for review. Please verify independently. That was it. No story, no framing, no attempt to steer the outcome. I attach the files and read it once more, checking for tone, accuracy, restraint. When I clicked submit, there was no rush of relief, no surge of satisfaction, just a quiet sense of alignment, like a machine clicking back into proper timing after running off balance for too long. I closed the laptop and sat there with my hands flat on the table, breathing slow, knowing there was no pulling this back now. That afternoon, I left the house and drove without thinking until I ended up back at the VFW. Not for counsel, but for grounding. The smell of coffee and old wood settled me the way it always had. Walt gave me a nod and slid a mug across the table without asking questions. I told him I'd passed information along to the proper people, not to hurt anyone, but because it was the right thing to do. He listened and said something simple. Truth has a way of choosing its own timing. You don't control what it hits when it lands. You just decide whether you're standing in its way. I drove home as evening fell, the sky dim and even, and for the first time since that night on the stage, I felt steady without bracing. Whatever came next would not be because I lashed out. It would be because I finally stepped aside and let reality move forward on its own terms. The response did not come immediately, and I did not expect it to. Systems like that move slow on purpose. But the shift was noticeable within days. Conversations changed tone, questions started circulating. Not accusations yet, just careful inquiries. People asking about procedures, about timing, about money that was supposed to be sitting still. I heard it secondhand through pauses in conversations, through messages that stopped mid-sentence, through the way her confidence no longer filled the room the way it used to. I stayed out of it, kept my routines steady. Work in the morning, coffee alone, evenings quiet. Because once you hand something over to process, you do not interfere, you wait. And waiting is something I had learned to do well. The formal notice arrived on a Thursday afternoon. A neutral envelope, no drama, just language that carried weight. An acknowledgement of materials received. A statement of review, nothing conclusive. Nothing forgiving either. I read it once, then folded it neatly and set it in the same drawer as everything else. This was no longer personal, that mattered. The situation had crossed from marriage into record, from emotion into accountability. And once that line is crossed, feelings stop being relevant. Facts take over. I did not call her, did not warn her. Not because I wanted her blindsided, but because the process demanded distance. Any involvement would have compromised the very thing I claimed to respect. And I was not going to undo my own integrity out of misplaced mercy. When the hearing date came through, short and official, my name listed only as a party of record, not an accuser. I felt a tightening in my chest that surprised me. Not fear, recognition. This was the moment when consequences stop being theoretical. I drove to the courthouse on a cold, clear morning, parked a few blocks away, and walked the rest. Hands in my pockets, breath steady. Inside the hallways smelled like old paper and polished floors. Voices low, restrained, I took a seat in the back and watched her arrive. Composed, professional, eyes searching the room. And when they landed on me, something flickered there. Not anger, not hatred, understanding, the kind that arrives too late to change direction. And as the proceedings began, slow and methodical, I realized something important. I had not dragged her here. I had simply stopped holding the door closed behind her. And now the truth was doing what truth always does when left alone long enough. It was walking forward on its own. The room stayed calm as the questions narrowed, each one quieter than the last, which somehow made them heavier. The official spoke without age or accusation, just asked for clarification, dates, explanations, and Diane answered smoothly, at first, practiced, confident, using words like temporary and administrative, the kind of language designed to reassure without revealing much. I watched her hands as she turned pages, the slight tremor when numbers were read aloud, the pause before answers that used to come easily. This wasn't a courtroom drama. There were no raised voices, just the slow tightening of a net built from facts. As the review continued, the rhythm shifted. Inconsistencies began to surface, small at first. A timeline that didn't quite align, a transfer described one way in writing and another way out loud. Nothing explosive on its own, but patterns don't need drama to be dangerous. They only need repetition. The room grew quieter with each question. Observers leaned forward without meaning to. Lawyers stopped whispering. And when a staff member stood to speak, voice shaking, saying they had been told not to worry about payroll because funds had been moved temporarily, I felt something settle in my chest. This was no longer about interpretation. It was about reliance. Diane turned toward the young woman, eyes wide, starting to explain, but the official raised a hand, not unkindly, and asked her to wait. The questions resumed, firmer now, amounts listed, account numbers read into the record, language precise and unforgiving, the kind that does not bend to intention. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt distance. The strange clarity that comes when something you carried is finally put down. This was no longer my marriage unraveling. It was a professional structure being examined under light it had avoided, and the difference mattered. When the ruling came, it was measured temporary restrictions. Further review, no final judgment yet, but enough to change everything. Diane's shoulders sagged just slightly, the smallest sign of fatigue, and when she looked back at me, our eyes met for a moment. I didn't nod, didn't look away, didn't offer anything, not punishment, not comfort, just presence. She finally saw what she had mistaken for weakness, patience, restraint, the refusal to perform, and she understood too late that those things don't disappear when ignored. They accumulate afterward. People stood slowly, voices low, a reporter scribbling notes, a client offering a quiet nod of thanks. I left without speaking to anyone, stepped back into the cold air outside the courthouse, the sky pale and clean, my breath steady in front of me. I did not open the envelope I was handed, did not check my phone. I sat in my truck for a moment with my hands on the wheel, listening to the engine idle, understanding something simple and final. I had not destroyed anything, I had stopped holding it together. And sometimes that is the only way the truth is allowed to show itself. The days after the hearing moved slower, like the world had shifted into a lower gear. The divorce paperwork advanced without drama, just signatures and schedules, no speeches left to give. People stopped calling as much, some out of discomfort, some out of loyalty to the version of events they preferred. I didn't chase explanations, I returned to routine. Early mornings, measured drives, coffee taken black at the kitchen table. The house no longer felt like a place waiting for someone else to come back. It felt neutral, honest. I noticed how much energy I used to spend anticipating moods, smoothing edges, making things easier for everyone but myself, and how quiet it was without that work. She came by one evening without warning. Not angry, not polished, just tired, hair loose, coat wrinkled. She stood in the doorway like she wasn't sure she had the right to step inside anymore. She said she wouldn't stay long, and she didn't. She said she hadn't meant for it to go that far, that the firm, the image, the applause had taken over faster than she expected. I listened without interrupting, leaning against the wall, letting her words land where they landed. She asked why I hadn't warned her, and I told her I had, just not loudly, that warnings whispered are still warnings. They just don't compete well with cheering crowds. Her eyes filled, then hardened, then softened again, a cycle I'd seen before. And for the first time I didn't feel responsible for guiding her through it. When she left, the door closed gently, no slam, no final scene, and I stood there for a moment listening to the house breathe. Something inside me settled, not relief, not victory, acceptance, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. The weeks that followed were quieter still. I spent more time at the VFW, helped a younger guy understand his first investment, took walks in the mornings when frost still clung to the grass. Life didn't get bigger, it got clearer. I learned that dignity doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small, consistent choices, in reading what you sign, in knowing when to step back, and trusting that the truth doesn't need help staying upright. It just needs time, and as I moved forward alone but steady, I understood something it had taken me years to see. Strength isn't loud, it's patient, it waits. And when it finally moves, it does so without needing anyone's applause. The house felt settled in the weeks that followed, not quiet in a lonely way, but calm like something that had finally stopped straining. Mornings came with frost on the grass and a pale sky that didn't rush me. I made coffee, sat at the table, and planned small things again, oil changes, walks, calls I'd put off, nothing dramatic, just life returning to its proper scale. I stopped waiting for updates, stopped checking my phone for reactions. Once the truth is handed over, hovering only cheapens it, and I had no interest in doing that anymore. I ran into people now and then at the store, at church, at the VFW. Some nodded, some avoided eye contact. A few surprised me by stopping to say they understood more than I thought. I didn't correct anyone, didn't explain my side again. Stories settle where they settle. You don't chase them without losing something important. What mattered was that I could sleep, that my shoulders weren't tight anymore, that I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head. I had spent years being careful so someone else could shine, and now that care had turned inward. Not selfishly, just honestly, one morning, sitting in that same leather chair she wanted replaced, I understood the shape of it all. She had believed strength was performance, applause, control of the room. I had believed strength was preparation, patience, knowing what you signed and when to step back. Neither belief is loud on its own, but only one survives when the noise fades. I didn't win anything. I didn't take revenge. I didn't celebrate her fall. I simply stopped carrying weight that was never meant to be permanent. And when I let go, the truth stood up on its own, steady and unembellished, exactly the way it always does. If you've ever been understated, laughed at, or treated like background noise while holding everything together, remember this: dignity doesn't argue. It documents, it waits, and it moves when the time is right. Patience isn't weakness, it's restraint with memory. And silence isn't surrender, it's space. Space for the truth to walk forward without being pushed. That's how I walked out of it. Not louder, not richer in applause, just lighter, clearer, and finally standing in a life that belonged to me again.